They brought in the body late on a Thursday, just after the sun had dipped below the ridge behind the chapel. The kind of delivery that comes with more silence than signatures. I'd been working the grounds for years, long enough to recognize when something didn't follow the usual script. There was no police escort, no grieving family, not even a name on the clipboard. Just a toe tag that read John Doe, and a rushed nod from the morgue assistant who looked like he couldn't get back into his van fast enough. He handed me the release form and turned on his heel before I could even ask where the paperwork was. That was the first sign. I didn't think much of it at first. Unnamed bodies come through now and then. Drifters, unclaimed hospital deaths, Jane Does with no traceable relatives. We buried them quickly, quietly, and usually under numbers rather than names. But when I wheeled the body into the prep room and reached for the zipper of the bag, my hands hesitated. Something about the weight of it felt familiar. Too familiar. It wasn't until I unzipped the bag halfway and saw the hair, dark, wavy, with a streak of gray over the right temple, that I felt the chill in the base of my spine. Still, I told myself it was coincidence, until I pulled the zipper all the way down. The face was mine. Not like a cousin, not like a stranger who looked oddly similar in a dim bar. I mean, it was my face. The same slope of the nose, same broken curve of the top lip where I'd split it falling off a bike at 9. The same tired crease between the brows that years of squinting into sun and stress had carved deep. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the gurney, nearly knocking over the steel table beside it. My knees didn't buckle, but they wanted to. I leaned in again, slowly, hoping I'd see it differently the second time, hoping it would fade into someone else's features, some uncanny resemblance, a cruel joke maybe, but it didn't. If anything, the closer I looked, the worse it got. He had a scar just below the left cheekbone, faint but curved, like a smile turned the wrong way. I had the same scar, only mine was faded now, almost forgotten. I got it when I was 13, wrestling with my younger brother in the backyard, tossing stones at each other after a stupid argument over a lost glove. The rock caught him in the face, left a red arc that bled for hours. He never stopped reminding me of it, until he vanished. My brother Eli disappeared when he was 16. One day he went to school and never came back. No note, no warning, just a backpack found near the river and an open case that never closed. That was 20 years ago. And this body, this man, hadn't aged a day. I checked the tag again. John Doe. No birth date, no medical file, no personal effects. Just a plastic bag with a folded black coat and a silver lighter, the exact kind I used to carry before I quit smoking. I opened the bag slowly. The coat had a tear on the inside lining, just below the chest, stitched with a thread I remembered stealing from our mother's drawer. No one would have patched it like that, unless they were me. Panic settled in then, but not the kind that made you run. The kind that rooted you to the floor and made every breath feel like dragging gravel through your lungs. I sat on the bench and stared at the body for what must have been an hour. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me like they were struggling to stay alive too. I ran through everything in my head. Was I dreaming? Hallucinating? Had I finally snapped from all the years alone with the dead? I'd read about breakdowns, identity delusions, trauma-induced episodes. Maybe I was having one. Maybe this was my mind cracking like old stone. But the clock kept ticking, and the body didn't change. It stayed me. Every detail down to the callus on the left thumb from years of shoveling and the faint freckle near the collarbone. I reached out once, pressed my fingers against the skin. It was cold, firm, real. I recoiled. There were no orders beyond bury by sundown, no autopsy, no embalming. The paper trail was thinner than a shadow, and I was the only one scheduled on shift. Normally I'd have called someone, my supervisor maybe, but something held me back, a pressure in the air. A whisper in the back of my skull that told me this wasn't meant to be seen by others, that whatever this was, it had chosen me. I walked the body to the prep chamber, wrapped it in a fresh shroud. Every movement felt like betrayal, like I was sealing away a secret I hadn't agreed to keep. As I loaded the casket, I caught sight of the mirror above the sink. For a moment, it looked empty. Then, for a split second, it showed both of us, me and the man I was about to bury, standing side by side. No difference. I turned away quickly. My hands were shaking. I told myself I had a job to finish. The sun was sinking and the grave was ready. Plot 39B, an old part of the grounds with uneven markers and stones that leaned like they were exhausted from standing. I rolled the casket to the edge and hesitated. Part of me wanted to open it one last time, to confirm, to confront, but I didn't. I lowered it slowly. The thud of the casket hitting bottom echoed louder than it should have. The dirt felt heavier than usual, like the earth itself was reluctant to take him. I buried slowly, methodically, No words, no rites, just shovelful after shovelful until the coffin was gone. I tamped the top layer and marked it with a wooden cross, unsigned. That night, I sat alone in the office. The records were logged, the paperwork filed, but the image wouldn't leave me. My own face, still and cold. A mirror with no glass, a joke with no punchline, and deep inside, a knot of dread tightened. Because even after he was in the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't buried him at all. I'd buried myself. They didn't let me look for long. I wasn't supposed to unzip the body bag, just wheel it from the van to the prep room and lower it into the transport box. But there was something about the weight of it. Not just how it shifted on the gurney, but the way the corners of the body pressed against the vinyl, like it had been folded wrong. The shape of the shoulders, too familiar. The curve of the skull, too specific. I told myself I only unzipped it to verify that the morgue hadn't made another mistake like last winter when they sent over a Jane Doe meant for another county. But the second I saw that face, the breath caught in my throat like a mouthful of soil. It wasn't just similar, it was mine, or close enough to freeze the blood behind my eyes. The skin was paler, more translucent, but the cheekbones, the set of the jaw, the widow's peak we both inherited from our mother, all there. But what pulled the memory out of its hiding place was the scar, right below the left ear, curved like a hook, faint but unmistakable. I remember giving that scar. I was 10, he was 8. We were fighting in the woods behind our house, a stupid game gone too far. I shoved him, he tripped, hit a rusted fence post. The cut bled forever. Mom screamed. He needed 4 stitches and a tetanus shot. I never forgot that scream. I never forgot how I cried harder than he did. He never blamed me, never even brought it up, but I did. I carried it for years, even after he vanished. Even after the posters came down and the police stopped calling. 20 years of silence. No sightings, no leads. And then this body, with that scar. Exactly the same shape, in exactly the same place. But this man hadn't aged, not even a wrinkle. His skin was taut, not in a preserved way, but like he'd simply gone to sleep and never woken up. His hands were calloused in the same pattern mine were back when we used to fish, the way we'd wrap the lines too tight around our palms. The pinky on his right hand, slightly crooked, just like mine, just like his used to be. I backed away from the table and sat down on the prep bench, gripping the edge like I might fall backward into some deep invisible hole. The morgue had no name. The form said John Doe in sloppy ink. The toe tag was blank, not even a case number. When I asked for more info, the transport guy just shrugged and said, "We're told to stay quiet. Just get it done by sundown." It was too convenient, too rehearsed. I couldn't breathe. I kept going back to that summer, the year he vanished, the journal I lost, the voice I thought I heard calling from the woods one night and never mentioned to anyone. I had dreams back then that he wasn't really dead, just locked somewhere cold, watching, waiting. And now, here he was. Only he wasn't here, not really. Just the shape of him, just the body. I leaned in again, just to be sure I wasn't going mad. I needed to find something, anything, that could prove this was just coincidence. A trick of the mind. Maybe a cadaver who looked like me. But the scar, that damn scar wouldn't let go. It dragged me down memory lane like a chain through mud. I remembered the summer our dad got sick, and we had to sleep in the same bed. The way he used to hum in his sleep. I remembered his laugh, the way he covered his mouth like it embarrassed him. And now this mouth, this lifeless mouth, hung open just enough to show the chipped incisor he broke falling off his bike. The same tooth, the same chip. And yet, I had no answers. No one asked me any questions. They just handed me the shovel and pointed to plot 103F. "Get it done," they said again. By sundown. I nodded like a puppet. Drove the body to the edge of the hill. Lowered it myself. No service, no marker. Just a wooden cross hammered into the soil with one nail bent at the head. The dirt felt heavy that day. Not from the rain, because it hadn't rained. It was dry, too dry. Cracked in places like it was thirsty. I had to force the first few shovelfuls in with my boot. I glanced once more at the body before covering the face. That scar, that tooth, that jawline, all stared back at me, and I wanted to scream, but instead I just said, "I'm sorry," and shoveled the dirt like it would drown the guilt before it sprouted. The sun touched the horizon just as I flattened the final mound. My back ached, my hands shook, and the shovel felt like it belonged to someone else. I left the cross in place and turned away, but I didn't go home. I sat in the tool shed until nightfall, lights off, breathing shallow, listening. Not for coyotes or wind, but for something else. Something that didn't belong above ground. And in the darkness, with my coat wrapped tight, I whispered aloud a question I didn't want answered. Why now? There was no response. just the sound of dry grass bending under its own weight. But I knew the silence wasn't empty. It never is. Not when you bury someone who shares your face. They told me to finish before sundown, and I did, but not because I was afraid of the dark, or because of the rules. I did it because I couldn't bear to see that face under daylight a second longer. I couldn't bear to keep making eye contact with a man who shouldn't exist anymore. A man who looked like he'd been peeled straight out of my childhood and preserved like some grotesque souvenir. There was no ceremony, no rites, no words. Just the scrape of a rusted shovel cutting into tired soil. I didn't wear gloves, even though I always do. My skin met the wooden handle directly, and I could feel every splinter digging in. I welcomed it. I think some part of me wanted to bleed. I wanted something to spill, to remind me I was still up here and not lying in that box looking up at the sky for the last time. The grave I was assigned had been pre-dug a day prior, 103F, the far corner of the northern stretch, where the grass never quite grows right, and the air always smells a little like copper. It's the oldest part of the cemetery, bordered by stone foundations that have long since forgotten what they were meant to hold. Some people say that section used to be a churchyard, but I've never seen records confirming that. All I know is that the soil there doesn't like to settle. You tamp it down, walk away, come back 2 days later, and it's risen again, puffed up like it's breathing. I lowered the body in silence. The plastic wrapping made a soft crinkle as it rubbed against the edge of the plywood box, and I felt my stomach twist with something I couldn't name. I had the lid in my hand. My fingers didn't want to let it go. I should have said something. A prayer. A goodbye. Anything to mark the fact that a man who wore my face was being returned to the ground by my own hands. But the words caught in my throat, and all I could manage was an exhale through my teeth and the rough scrape of the lid sliding over the body. I nailed it shut like I was afraid he might sit up. 3 nails per side, hard and fast. The last one split the board slightly, and I cursed under my breath. Not because I cared about the wood, but because the split looked too much like a mouth opening. When I stood up to start shoveling, I realized how still everything was. Not the usual cemetery quiet, not the chirp of birds in the distance or the hum of cars from the county road, but a hollow stillness. Like the ground had swallowed the sound itself. The shovel felt heavier with each lift. I threw in the first scoop of dirt, and immediately hated the way it sounded. The soft thump like it had landed on a pillow instead of a person. My breath came short, not from exhaustion but from unease. Like I was doing something backward. Like I wasn't burying him. I was covering him up. Like I was hiding evidence. The sun had started to dip low behind the row of oaks, casting long shadows across the grave, and every time my shovel dipped and rose, I imagined someone watching me from the trees. I never looked. I didn't want to. I was afraid of who, or what, I might see. I talked to myself under my breath, nonsense phrases, just to keep the silence from winning. I think I said, almost done, 20 times. I think I apologized once, but I don't remember for what. By the time I reached the last layer, I had stopped feeling the muscles in my arms. They moved on their own, like they weren't mine anymore. The mound was neat, too neat. I flattened it out with the back of the shovel and stepped back, wiping sweat from my brow even though the air had turned cold. I was about to plant the cross when I noticed the soil shift, just slightly, under my boot. A small sigh, like the earth exhaling. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the mound, waiting for something to break the surface. Nothing did. But that was somehow worse. I planted the cross. 1 nail in the center. No name. No dates. Just wood. I looked at it for a long time, thinking maybe the weight of my stare would sink it a little deeper, drive it further into the soil like an anchor. I walked away slowly, not because I was tired, but because part of me didn't want to turn my back. That part of the cemetery doesn't have cameras. The county won't pay for it. They say no one visits those graves anymore, but I always felt like someone did. Not the living, but the ones who've stayed longer than they should have. I didn't lock the gate when I left. I never do. It always swings open again anyway, like the cemetery breathes better that way. When I got home, I sat in the kitchen with the lights off. My wife asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired. She said my hands were shaking. I said it was the cold. I lied twice in one sentence. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake and listened. Not for noises in the house, but for shovels, for dirt being moved, for the knock of wood under pressure. I don't know what I expected. Maybe the sound of something crawling back up. Maybe the creak of that lid splitting open. But what I heard was worse. Nothing. No dreams. No sound. Just the ache of the silence I'd buried with him. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if I had buried the wrong man. Or if I was the wrong man, standing on the wrong side of the grave. 2 days passed before I went back to the office. I'd been avoiding it, taking longer walks through the rows of stone, pretending the grass needed more trimming or the fence posts another coat of paint. Anything to delay sitting back down at that desk. But eventually, the paperwork started piling up. Burials logged, supply orders to approve, calls from the county I kept ignoring. So I opened the door, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been touched in months, and stepped inside with that quiet reluctance I usually reserved for wakes. The office is just a wooden shack with a tin roof that sings when it rains. There's a coffee machine that leaks, a fan that never turns, and a single bulb that flickers like it's always deciding whether to die. My desk sat beneath the window, same as always. Chair slightly turned from when I left it, the top cluttered with folders, pens I didn't remember leaving uncapped, a cracked mug I should have thrown away years ago. But something felt off, subtly, like the air had been disturbed, like someone had sat there, leaned back, breathed into the space without asking. Then, I saw it. A single sheet of parchment folded neatly in half, resting in the center of my desk, perfectly aligned with the edge as if placed there with care. There was no envelope, no stamp, no logo or address, just the paper, aged slightly, cream-colored, edges curled just a bit from the air. I didn't recognize it. My name wasn't written on it. In fact, nothing was. At least, not on the outside. I stood for a while just staring at it, keys still in my hand, unsure if I should touch it. But curiosity has always been louder than caution, and my fingers moved before I could second guess. The texture was soft, fibrous, not machine-made. This was the kind of paper people used when they meant something. I unfolded it slowly, like peeling back skin, and inside was a single sentence written in black ink. That wasn't supposed to be me. No name, no signature, no explanation, just 7 words. 7 words that sent a chill up the back of my spine so sharp I almost dropped the paper. I read them again, and again, and again. Each time the letters seemed darker, the ink thicker, like it had been pressed deep into the fibers, like it was less written and more carved. I sat down hard, the chair creaking under me, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out. My first instinct was to laugh it off, call it a prank, maybe some bored teenager sneaking in. But the paper didn't fit that theory. This wasn't grocery receipt graffiti or torn notebook scribbles. This felt intimate, purposeful. I flipped it over, checked for watermarks, marks, even smelled it. It had a faint scent, dust, ash, something earthy. I glanced at the door, still shut, locked, windows the same. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing, just the letter, waiting like it had always belonged there. The phrase echoed in my skull. That wasn't supposed to be me. What did that mean? The man I buried, his face, his scar, his body like a mirror left out too long in the rain. Could it be him? Was this his message? I pulled open the drawer, rifled through the burial logs. The page with his entry, number 1003F, was gone. Not misfiled, not tucked behind another sheet. Gone. As if it had never been written. My fingers went numb. I tried to recall writing it. I remember picking up the pen. I remember reaching for the form. But I don't remember the act of writing. My mind played tricks, flashing images of the burial again. The shovel, the mound, the creaking wood. But this time, there was something else. Me, watching myself bury the body. My coat, yes. My boots. But the expression was wrong. It wasn't dread. It was relief. I stood up too fast, knocking over the mug. Coffee-stained paper bled across the desk, but not the letter. That one remained dry, untouched, like it didn't belong to this world. I folded it back, slid it into my jacket pocket, not sure why I felt the need to keep it close. I didn't tell anyone. Not the sheriff, not the admin, not even my wife. That note was for me. I knew that deep down. Meant only for me. A whisper between dirt and flesh, between mirrors and memory. I walked the cemetery that evening, following my usual path but seeing everything different. The trees leaned in more. The stones stood taller. The air seemed to hush when I passed, like it too was waiting. I passed grave 103F. No sign of disturbance. No sign of anything. But the wooden cross looked straighter, cleaner, as if someone had fixed it. The soil was flat, but too flat, like it had been pressed by a hand, not settled by time. I knelt beside it, hand resting on the cool earth, and listened. I don't know what I expected to hear, breathing maybe, or shifting dirt, but all I heard was my own heart thudding like a slow drum. I whispered, was it supposed to be me? The wind picked up just then, carrying the scent of old leaves and something sweeter, like smoke or incense. I stayed there until the stars came out, until my knees ached and my fingers went numb. The letter remained in my pocket the whole time, pulsing faintly against my chest, like a second heartbeat. When I returned to the office, I checked the camera feeds. All of them. Nothing. No figures. No intrusions. No signs of anyone entering the room where I'd found the letter. I stared into that grainy, black and white footage, hoping to catch even the slightest flicker. But the tape didn't lie. No one was there, but the letter was. And that meant one of two things. Either the man I buried found a way to send messages from beneath the ground, or I never buried him at all. The next morning, before the sun even burned through the mist above the treetops, I was back at my desk, the letter spread out in front of me like an autopsy, my hands flat on either side, as if I needed to hold it down so it wouldn't vanish. I hadn't slept. My mind kept circling the same impossible loop. The body with my face, the letter that hadn't been mailed, the words carved in ink that sounded more like a warning than a confession. I kept reading that line over and over. That wasn't supposed to be me. It wasn't just what it said, but how it looked. That handwriting. Something about it had needled its way into my gut the moment I saw it. And now that I had time to really study it under daylight, I understood why. It was mine. Not just similar. Not inspired by. Mine. I know my handwriting better than I know my own reflection. And not because I have the prettiest penmanship. Quite the opposite, really. It's uneven. Sharp where it shouldn't be. Smooth where most others stumble. My O's are narrow, like they're trying not to be seen. My G's have long tails, exaggerated and dragging low, almost theatrical. The M's I make look like a row of broken fence posts, the second peak always shorter than the first. And there it was. Every quirk, every error, every little twitch of muscle memory laid out in front of me in that note. It was like someone had peeled my hand off my wrist, written it themselves, and then placed it back before I noticed. But that's the thing. I hadn't written it. I never touched that pen. And still, somehow, the paper knew me. That's when I started remembering things. Not full memories. Fragments. Like postcards from a place I once visited but never admitted to. An old shoebox. My brother's room. A leather-bound book with a broken spine. My childhood journals. We weren't rich growing up. Couldn't afford cameras or film. But I had paper. Always paper. I'd write to escape. Notes. Letters. Stories I'd never show anyone. And I was obsessive. Neat. Territorial. No one else touched my notebooks. Especially not my twin. My brother was the wild one. He climbed fences, broke windows, laughed when he bled. I wrote. I stayed inside. I built a world on the page and lived in it when the real one got too loud. I remember one summer, maybe we were 12, I let him read a story I'd written. Just once. He laughed, called it creepy smart guy stuff, and tossed it under the bed. I never showed him another word. Never let him near my notebooks again. He didn't care about writing. He didn't care about my G's or my narrow O's. But now I was looking at this paper, these letters, and feeling something I hadn't felt in 20 years. That moment of betrayal. That bitter taste of being copied, mocked, stolen from. But this didn't feel like mockery. This felt reverent. Like someone had studied me with the patience of a monk and then left this behind as proof. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. Personal logs, old cemetery shift notes, death certificates filed by hand before the office went digital. I flipped through until I found one from last fall. An entry I knew I'd written. The death of an old man named Harris, I think. Cause, natural. Age, 93. Signature, mine. I pulled it out, laid it side by side with the letter. The loops, the breaks, the angle, identical. I felt bile rise. Either someone had forged my handwriting down to the fracture, or, God help me, I had written that note and didn't remember doing it. But I'd remember writing something like that. I had to. My brain felt like it was trying to unzip itself. I stood up, pacing the room, palms sweaty, tongue dry. I needed proof. Something physical, tangible. I drove home, heart rattling the whole way, barely watching the road. My wife was out. I was thankful. I went straight to the garage, dug through boxes until I found the one I was looking for. Old belongings from my parents' attic. Stuff I'd kept when they sold the house. Inside, a tin lunchbox filled with old school notes, comic clippings, one dried rose from a funeral I couldn't place. And at the bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was one of my childhood journals. Blue cover, spiral bound, pages yellowed at the edges. I opened it. There were my stories, my letters to nobody, my thoughts scrawled in the way only a 12-year-old trapped in his own head could scrawl. But then, halfway through the journal, the ink changed. The entries had different dates, recent dates, dated from the past week, but the handwriting, it was mine, word for word, stroke for stroke, the same broken fence post M's, the same theatrical G's. I'm not angry, one entry said. I just want to finish what we started. Another read, You've always had the better life. I was just waiting for you to notice. I flipped to the last page. The entry was dated the day after the burial. It said, "It fits better now. The body, the skin, but your hands are still mine." I dropped the journal, stepped back like it had burned me. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. My brother disappeared when we were teenagers. Vanished. One night he went out for cigarettes and never came back. No body, no note, nothing. My parents thought he'd run away. I secretly believed he'd died. Now, I wasn't sure. I called the morgue, asked to speak to the tech who signed off the body I buried. She said she remembered me, said I'd delivered the paperwork in person, said I'd been wearing a black coat, same one I always wore. I don't own a black coat, haven't since I left high school. She described my face, my height, my voice. "You're the one who brought him in," she said. "Why are you asking about yourself?" I hung up. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone. I went to the mirror, stared at my face. My eyes, my mouth, my chin. That scar from the dog bite. My reflection looked back at me, but now I couldn't trust it. I didn't know if the handwriting was mine anymore, or if the body in the ground was, or if I even was. That night I burned the journal, every page. I watched the flames turn my own words to ash. But as I closed the lid of the fire pit, I noticed something behind the logs. Another page, one I hadn't written. I pulled it out. Same parchment, same ink. One sentence. "You can burn the paper, but not the hand that wrote it." I didn't sleep. I just stared at my hands, waiting to see if they'd move without me. The journal had burned, or at least I thought it had. I'd stayed up the entire night, feeding it to the fire page by page, breathing in the bitter, acrid scent of old ink and childhood memory turning to smoke. I watched the edges curl and blacken, the flames licking at every paragraph I had once written, or that someone had written in my name. By the time the sun began to rise, all that remained were flakes of ash and the lingering smell of something that felt too personal to destroy. I told myself it was done, that whatever presence had tied itself to that notebook had been severed, but something didn't let go. Not in me, and not out there. I spent that day moving through routines like a man underwater, each step sluggish, muffled, disconnected from sound and purpose. I walked the perimeter of the cemetery, noted the wind had shifted directions. The leaves rustled, not like they were reacting to the breeze, but to something approaching. It's a hard thing to describe, but I've worked this land for long enough to know when something has changed beneath the surface. And something had. I checked the grave again, the one that had started it all. The soil looked undisturbed now, no signs of the shifting that had rattled me days before. But the air around it was cold in a way that wasn't natural, not temperature cold, stillness cold. Like the earth itself was holding its breath. I didn't dare dig, not yet. I just stood there, staring, until a drop of sweat traced a line down my back despite the chill. That evening, I returned home early, telling myself I'd rest, clear my head. But I didn't sit down. I went straight to the basement where I kept the rest of my old belongings. Most people have skeletons in their closets. Mine were pressed between notebook pages and stashed in rotting boxes. I rummaged through every one, looking for something, anything, that would remind me who I had been and whether I was still him. And then I found it, tucked behind a box of forgotten photo albums, wrapped in the same blue t-shirt I thought I'd burned alongside the journal. Another journal. No, not another. The same. The one I'd destroyed. It was still dirty around the edges, still smelled faintly of fire and mildew, but it was intact. I opened the first page. The handwriting was mine. Every stroke, every hesitation, every crossed-out word. But the entries had changed. I flipped through and saw that some of the older entries had been rewritten, subtly altered. Not just grammar or phrasing, intent. A sentence that used to say, "I'm scared he's not coming back," now said, "He knew he'd return." Another page that once read, "He never liked my stories," now read, "He always envied the way I told them." And then the newer entries, dated that very morning. "You tried to destroy me," one line said, "but I've already been buried. You only buried the wrong version." Another read, "We shared the same hand once. You gave me words. I gave you silence." My throat tightened. I closed the journal quickly, afraid of what might be on the last page. I couldn't look, not yet. Instead, I clutched it to my chest, staggered up the stairs and out into the night. I didn't know where I was going until I got there. The graveyard. I walked past the gates, through rows of headstones, all the way to the back, to the place where the unknown are laid to rest. The ones with no families, no visitors, no names. Where I'd buried the body with my face. I stood at the edge of the grave and held the journal out in front of me. "This isn't mine," I whispered. "You can have it back." I dropped it into the soil. Not into a hole, not into a dug-up pit, just onto the grass, onto the earth that seemed too quiet. I turned to walk away, but before I reached the path, I heard the faintest sound, a scrape, like nails on parchment. I turned. The journal was open now, flipped to the last page. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. I knelt, heart hammering, and read the sentence etched in that painfully familiar handwriting. "I'll stop writing when you stop pretending to be the only one left." I left it there, walked away. But as I turned the corner near the chapel, something caught my eye. On the small bulletin board where we post obituaries, someone had pinned a photo. I approached. It was old, faded, a boy with a sharp jaw, a familiar mouth, wearing a school uniform I hadn't seen in decades. Below it, typed neatly, was a name, my brother's. Date of birth, same as mine. Date of death, blank. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I reached for the pin, tore the paper down, turned it over. Another message, scrawled in ink I recognized. "We buried me, but now we need to bury you." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with every light on, breathing through shallow gulps, my eyes fixed on my own hands. I watched them for hours, waiting to see if they'd pick up a pen and start writing on their own. The moment I found the cassette tape, I felt something pull in my chest. Not metaphorical, physical, like the sudden tightness before a panic attack, or the jolt you feel when you've forgotten something crucial but can't recall what. It was wedged inside the back cover of the journal I thought I'd destroyed, now inexplicably whole and returned to me. The tape wasn't labeled, no sticker, no title, not even a smudge of ink. Just blank black plastic with a worn center spool and a bit of magnetic ribbon that looked faintly warped by time or heat or something else that doesn't leave evidence. I held it for a long time, rotating it in my fingers, the way you do with something you're afraid might break reality if handled wrong. My instinct was to throw it, to destroy it like I had tried with the journal. But there was something heavier here, a weight I couldn't name. That cassette was meant for me alone. I couldn't resist it, not because I wanted to know, but because I feared not knowing more. So I dug out an old tape player from the bottom of the storage cabinet in the cemetery office. One of those dusty, half-forgotten devices left behind from a decade that felt like a fever dream now. It clicked when I inserted the tape, as if the machine itself recognized what was coming. I pressed play. For the first 3 seconds there was only static, then a voice. My voice, but not quite. The cadence was mine, the intonations, the quiet pauses I take between thoughts. But there was a coldness in the way the words formed, a clarity too precise, too rehearsed. "You buried me," the voice said, "but I didn't stay gone." My hands began to tremble. The tape whirred on. "You burned my stories. Thought fire could undo a trade that was never yours to break. But words don't die, they wait." I paused the tape, breathed, told myself it was a prank. Some twisted thing I must have made years ago. Maybe a therapy exercise, a forgotten recording. But I knew better. I knew what my voice sounded like, and I had never said these things. I pressed play again. He was supposed to stay on the other side, but you kept writing. You kept talking. You couldn't leave well enough alone. The air in the room shifted, heavy, like something watching from just beyond the walls. I heard a chair creak behind me, though I was alone. "The difference between a grave and a door is whether you lock it," the tape continued. "You left mine open." There was a long silence. Then the voice changed. Same tone, same words, but slower, closer. "Let me out," that phrase repeated, louder. "Let me out," then faster, overlapping. Dozens of versions of my voice, layered atop each other, screaming, whispering, pleading. "Let me out." The machine popped. The tape ejected itself. I backed away like it had bitten me. My palms were damp. I checked the door. Still locked. Windows closed. Lights flickering. I picked up the tape again. The reel had wound itself back to the beginning. I should have left. Should have gone home. Burned the journal again. Crushed the tape. Buried them both beneath concrete. But instead, I rewound. Sat down. Pressed play once more. This time, after the static, there was a new section. A moment I hadn't heard before. The voice said, "You remember the tree, don't you?" And I did. Before I could stop myself, the image rose. The willow tree behind our childhood home. The one my brother and I used to sit beneath. The one he carved something into, then made me swear not to read it until he was gone. "Look there," the voice on the tape said. That's where it started. The tape ended with a low hum, like a breath drawn through soil. I left the office in a daze. The cassette still clutched in my hand. I didn't lock the door behind me. I walked all the way to the edge of the cemetery, to the line where the gravel path met the old woods. Beyond it, nothing but memory. I hadn't been back to that house in years. It had been sold, painted over, its past covered like makeup over a bruise. But the tree, Maybe the tree was still there. I made the drive at midnight, the tape player on the seat beside me like a passenger. I didn't speak. The voice had said enough for both of us. When I arrived, the house was quiet, empty. A foreclosure sign tilted in the yard, grass dead, windows broken. But the tree was still standing, taller than I remembered, twisted, gnarled, and on its trunk, barely visible in the moonlight, a carving. I traced it with my fingers. Letters worn by weather but still readable. Switch. Just that word. No initials. No date. Just a command. A memory. A deal. I turned around to leave, but at the edge of the yard, something moved. A figure. Not quite a man, not quite a shadow. It raised one hand, waved. The same wave I'd seen in the cemetery. Same posture. Same coat. I blinked, and it was gone. I checked the tape player. It had started on its own. The voice spoke one final time. You left the door open. Now it's your turn to knock. When I returned to the grave the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the air. It was still, but not calm. Compressed, as if sound itself had been drawn inward. The birds that usually nested near the chapel roof were silent. Even the wind that rustled the dry pines held back, like it too knew what had shifted. I walked with that same heaviness in my chest I'd felt since the tape, since the journal, since the whisper of that word carved into the bark. Switch. My boots crunched over gravel and frostbitten grass, and I knew the moment I reached the plot that something was different. The wooden cross no longer bore his name. It bore mine, not painted, not carved, burned, charred into the wood like some twisted brand. And beneath it, where I'd once left a simple nameplate etched by the morgue with unknown mail, March 3rd, there was now a brass tag, shiny, untarnished, like it had just been screwed in that morning. My full name, first, middle, last, birth date exact. Even the hyphen in my middle name that only appeared on my military paperwork. I knelt beside it, fingers trembling as I reached to brush away the dirt near the base. The soil was different, turned, aerated, like it had breathed recently. The grass around it hadn't browned like the rest of the yard. It looked alive, almost nourished. I tried to pull the tag off the cross, but it didn't budge, as though it had grown into the grain itself. I looked over my shoulder then, suddenly paranoid someone might be watching, but the cemetery was still, dead. I whispered into the earth, not knowing why, maybe out of habit or desperation. What do you want? There was no response. But I could feel it, the weight of attention, like something was listening but politely choosing not to answer. I stood up and took a step back, just as the wind returned. It came all at once, sharp, cold, carrying with it the scent of pine sap and wet stone. I looked to my left, and there, just beyond the old willow near the boundary wall, was another grave, one I'd never noticed before. It hadn't been marked in my shift schedule, no records, no notes from Charlie, the old groundskeeper. But there it was, modest, rectangular, a fresh pile of soil mounded too perfectly to be coincidence. I walked toward it slowly, like approaching a sleeping dog. The shovel I kept by the chapel door, the one I swore I'd never use again, was now leaning against the headstone, and folded neatly beside it, my jacket. The same one I'd been wearing the night I buried the John Doe, same frayed collar, same cigarette burn on the sleeve. I hadn't lost that coat. I'd hung it in my office closet 2 nights ago. I ran. I didn't look back. I locked myself in the records room and went straight for the burial logs. March 3rd, John Doe. But now, the entry had changed. The name was mine, and the signature at the bottom of the release form, the one I had written in haste that evening, had been replaced with a copy too precise, too perfect. It was my signature, but it wasn't in my handwriting. It was smoother, slower, like someone trying to remember how I used to write. I flipped back to earlier pages in the log. My brother's name wasn't there. It never had been. Every grave I thought was his had been reassigned, changed. One by one, names shifted in the registry like pieces of a puzzle I never noticed I was solving. People I buried had been replaced. Slight changes, different names, slightly different dates, but the same plots, the same spots. I closed the ledger and stared at the wall for what felt like hours. The cemetery was no longer a map of memory. It was a rewrite. I walked back out, knowing I shouldn't, but I had to see it again. The grave with my name. It was still there, but now something else had changed. A bouquet, fresh flowers, set neatly at the base of the cross. Lilies, my wife's favorite. The kind she used to set at the dinner table before she left, before she stopped speaking to me, before the divorce. I bent down and saw a small card tucked between the stems. It read, "He says thank you. He's warm now." No name, just those words. And at the bottom, A scribbled note in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was 12. Don't be afraid. You were always the better one. It was his, my brother's, the way he used to write before the accident, before he disappeared. I stood up, stumbled back, and nearly tripped over a shadow that wasn't there a second ago. A tall figure at the far end of the yard, wearing my old boots, holding a shovel. He raised one hand, fingers curled just the way I do when I wave. I blinked. He was gone. I walked home in silence that night, left the lights off, didn't eat, didn't sleep. I kept waiting for the knock at the door. It never came. But when I woke the next morning, the note was gone from the table. In its place, my birth certificate, the original, the one I thought had been lost in the fire. But now it listed a different date of death, a future date, 1 week from now. And beneath it, a line I hadn't seen before. Reassigned, grave 47B, confirmed. I didn't go back to the cemetery the next day. I couldn't. I paced the perimeter of my house like a caged animal, checking locks I'd already turned, curtains I'd already drawn, lights I'd already left off. The silence inside had changed, thickened. It used to feel like safety. Now it felt like breath being held by something watching me from behind the walls. I left the certificate on the table, hoping maybe it would change again if I didn't touch it, that maybe it would list someone else's name next time, or erase the death date altogether. But it didn't. It just sat there, waiting, like the grave. I lasted 2 more nights without going back, but by the third I felt pulled, not called, not like some mystic tug, but magnetized, as if something had reached into the marrow of my spine and was winding it forward. I told myself I was just going to check, just going to confirm that what I'd seen before hadn't been real, that it was fatigue, grief, memory turning in on itself. I even told myself I might bring a crowbar, dig up the coffin and get this over with. The thought terrified me, but the not knowing, it burned more. The gates squealed the way they always did when I pushed them open, but the cemetery was different. The path felt longer, like the land had stretched while I was away. The moonlight lit only what was directly in front of me, as if the rest of the graveyard had receded into another plane, just out of reach. I didn't bother with my flashlight. I didn't want to see anything beyond what was necessary. My boots sank slightly into the earth when I reached the grave, my grave. The soil was damp again, though it hadn't rained in a week. The shovel was still there, resting against the cross like it had never been moved, though the wood on the handle was now darker, smoother, polished by use. I took 1 step closer, then another. I crouched beside the mound and placed my hand against the dirt. It was warm. I pulled it back instinctively, wiping my palm against my jeans, but I could still feel it radiating. Not heat, presence. That's when I heard it. Faint, deliberate, not frantic like claws on wood or fists against a coffin. Rhythmic, measured, scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly across the inside of a box. I stood frozen for what felt like entire seasons. I wanted to run. My knees said run. My gut screamed it. But my spine, the same spine that had pulled me here, refused. I lowered myself to my knees and pressed my ear against the dirt. The sound was clearer now. Not just scratching, something else. Breathing, paired with movement. Slow, heavy inhales, like someone trying not to panic in a confined space. Then I heard paper, the soft rustle of it being folded. I grabbed the shovel without realizing it, dug with shaking arms and a locked jaw 6 inches down, then 8, then 10. The scratching stopped when I hit something soft. Not wood, not stone, paper. I clawed at the dirt with my bare hands until I uncovered the envelope. It was wax sealed in red, the same seal I'd seen once before, on the note that had carried my name. This time, it didn't have a name on it. Just a sentence burned faintly into the parchment with something hotter than ink. Let's switch back. I dropped it. It fell onto the dirt and landed perfectly upright, balanced. I stared at it, waiting. Nothing moved. No more scratching. No more breath. Just the quiet between us. I picked it up with numb fingers and ran. Didn't check the time. Didn't lock the gate behind me. I sat in the chapel office, the one I hadn't used since this all began, and laid the envelope on the desk like it might explode. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. I broke the seal with the blade of my pocket knife and unfolded the parchment slowly. The words inside were simple. You're tired. I remember. I can keep going. You were always better above. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. The handwriting was mine again, looser than the first note, not like someone imitating it. This time, it was authentic, like I'd written it in a daze or while sleepwalking, or like I'd written it from below. I reached for my journal, the one I'd found buried in my storage chest, and flipped through to the last page I'd read. There, tucked in as if it had always belonged, was another page I hadn't seen. The ink was fresh. The date was today. It gets quieter the longer you stay. You stop needing names, stop needing time. But memory is tricky. It loops. You start to think you're the one who came first, but you weren't. I was. I dropped the journal, my hands slick with sweat. I ran to the mirror on the back wall, stared at myself, the same face, same eyes, same scar above the brow. But something was wrong. The reflection blinked too slowly, moved half a second behind. I lifted my left hand. It lifted its right. The mirror was a second behind. Just a second, but it felt like a year. I shouted, punched the glass. It cracked, but didn't break. My reflection stared calmly, unmoved, with a small smile forming beneath its eyes. That's when I knew. Whoever was beneath the dirt hadn't just written letters. He'd rewritten me, or was rewriting. I left the chapel and locked the door behind me. I'm not sure why. Habit, maybe, or fear that something might follow me out. The grave was quiet when I passed it again, but now there was a second envelope placed on the cross. I didn't open it. Not yet. It's on my nightstand as I write this. Still sealed. Still waiting. The last one said, "Let's switch back." But now I'm not sure who's asking, or who I am. I started watching myself. Not metaphorically, not in some introspective crisis of identity sense, but literally, standing by the back gate of the cemetery each night, beneath the broken light where the shadows stretched long enough to hide me from the chapel windows. I watched him as he moved through my routine. He used my keys, wore my boots, even carried the limp in my left leg from the time I fell off the service truck 5 years ago. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, that some cocktail of guilt and insomnia had finally cracked something loose in my mind. But no, this wasn't a projection. This wasn't a trick of memory or grief. He moved with purpose. He knew where every tool was, every drawer in the supply shed, every hidden cigarette tucked behind the old headstones. He lit them the way I did, cupping one hand against the wind that always seemed to breathe harder through the rows of the dead. He scratched the same spot on his chin when he was thinking, the same way I did. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? What could I say? That I'd buried a version of myself, and now I was being replaced by someone, or something, that remembered my life better than I did. I watched for 3 nights before he noticed me. I think he always knew I was there. But on the 3rd night, when I shifted to lean against the gate, he turned, ever so slightly, and held my gaze. No reaction, no surprise, just recognition. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just turned, and walked back toward the chapel, as if giving me permission to follow. I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready. I went home that night and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my bed had already been warmed, that my pillow remembered a different shape. I stood over the sink, brushing my teeth, watching the mirror for signs. But the man in the glass only copied me now, perfectly. No delays, no lag. It was worse somehow. That meant he was already in sync, already settled. The next morning, the cemetery looked more orderly than I'd left it. The flowers on graves 12 and 14 were replaced. The tools were cleaned and rehung. Even the chapel smelled different. Less mildew, more cedar and coffee. Like someone had moved in, quietly, and begun tending to things better than I ever did. I saw a notebook on the desk. My notebook. The one I used to track plots, requests, records. But the handwriting wasn't mine. Not exactly. It was neater, tighter. Like mine if I'd learned discipline I never had. The most recent entry simply read, "Visit from duplicate, non-aggressive, awaiting reintegration." I slammed the book shut and left. That night, I returned with the old key to the mortuary shed. I broke the lock. I had to see the body again. I had to know, had to prove that the thing walking in my skin was something else entirely. But the coffin was gone. Not just the body, the entire box. In its place was a hole in the dirt, smoothed over like a wound scarred in haste. At the bottom, folded into the space where the casket had been, was my old coat. The one I'd burned 3 years ago after a drunk fell asleep with a cigarette in plot 32 and nearly set me on fire trying to help him. I picked it up. It didn't smell like smoke anymore. It smelled like me. Now. I sat down in the dirt and stared at my hands. They were shaking, but not from cold. From recognition. From the creeping suspicion that maybe I was the one who'd stepped into the wrong place. That maybe I was the intruder now. I stayed there until dawn. That's when I saw him again. Walking the path between the rows, hands in pockets, whistling softly. A tune I couldn't place but felt like something we used to hum when we were boys. I stood. He stopped. We faced each other across 30 yards of silence. Then he spoke. Just one sentence. "You're not supposed to be here." I opened my mouth but nothing came out. He turned and walked away, back toward the chapel, as if that settled it. I looked down at my coat, still clutched in my hands. I looked at the shovel leaning against the cross, at the now-filled grave that still bore no name, and I realized, slowly, that maybe I was never meant to leave that ground, that maybe the letters, the voice on the tape, the journal, it was all part of a contract, a silent agreement made by something deeper than rules or blood, a balance being restored. He was better, stronger, more complete. I was the flaw, the half that broke, and now he was here to continue, whatever this life was meant to be. So now I wait. I don't go home anymore. I sit in the caretaker's shed, watching the chapel through the window, watching him lock up each night. I keep the envelope he left me in my back pocket. It hasn't changed. Still reads, "You're tired. I remember. I can keep going." I think I believe him, and yet, some small, gnawing piece of me still clings to the edge. Not because I want to reclaim my life, not because I think I can, but because I need to know who he is when I'm not watching, and who I'll become if I stop.